Thank you again for the birthday song at the beginning of worship. That was a surprise. It was reminding me that Helen, last week at the beginning of her sermon, was talking about birthdays, her parents' birthdays, remember, and how they were both born on July 4th the same year, and then how she always thought that you had to marry somebody that was born on your birthday, and so she looked it up, and that meant she could get to marry Ringo Starr. And I didn't know that was the competition I was facing at the time all the years ago. But it made me remember what my mom would always say to me about my birthday. She said, "You were born on July 8th. You know what's important about that day?" I'm thinking, well, hey, who am I going to get to marry? I don't know. She would say, "No, that's the day that the Liberty Bell cracked." And she would always say it like there was some kind of deep psychological significance to it. It still sort of burns me to this day. What do you think she meant? Me and the Liberty Bell both being cracked on the same day? I don't know. I'll let you figure it out. Our epistle lesson comes from Paul's second letter to the Corinthians. We're going to begin reading in chapter 12, but we find ourselves in the middle of an argument, really, that Paul's started back in chapter 10. And he is very upset and very defensive with accusations, perhaps by some of the people there in Corinth, that maybe he's not all the apostle he should be, and that there may actually be other apostles there. He actually calls them super apostles in one place that are more impressive than him, that are better speakers than he is, seem to have more power. And perhaps they in Corinth had started to follow some of their teachings rather than remembering the things that Paul had taught them. And Paul is very upset about this, and so he begins an argument in chapter 10, which sometimes scholars call his speech of fools, or a fool's speech, because Paul says, I don't want to have to engage in this argument in the same terms that these other people are arguing, because he's accusing them of boasting about themselves all the time. And so when he says that, what does he immediately begin to do? He immediately begins to lift up and talk about some of the things that have happened to him in comparison to those so-called super apostles. And that's where we find him going with this long list of all the things that he's suffered and endured, more than anyone else probably could have suffered or endured. And he keeps talking about it being foolish, because who in the world would brag about all these terrible things that had continued to happen to him? And then as he moves through that long list of the difficult circumstances that he's had to endure and the ways that he has behaved to them, then he moves on to another level of contrast or comparison with those he finds himself in struggle with for authority in Corinth. And this is where we pick up his argument in chapter 12. It is necessary to boast. Nothing is to be gained by it. But I will go on to visions and revelations of the Lord. I know a person in Christ who 14 years ago was caught up to the third heaven. Whether in the body or out of the body, I do not know. God knows. And I know that such a person, whether in the body or out of the body, I do not know, but God knows, was caught up into paradise and heard things that are not to be told, that no mortal is permitted to repeat. On behalf of such a one, I will boast. But on my own behalf, I will not boast, except of my weaknesses. But if I wish to boast, I will not be a fool, for I will be speaking the truth. But I refrain from it, so that no one may think better of me than what is seen in me or heard from me, even considering the exceptional character of the revelations. Sort of, can you imagine Paul doing this with his hands, holding one out like this, but the other going, come, 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 both at the same time? We're not sure exactly which way we're supposed to take him, are we? Therefore, to keep me from being too elated, a thorn was given me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me, to keep me from being too elated. 3 times I appealed to the Lord about this, that it would leave me. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for power is made perfect in weakness. So I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may dwell in me. Therefore I am content with weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities for the sake of Christ. For whenever I am weak, then I am strong. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Let us pray. Almighty God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts and our thoughts be acceptable in your sight, O God, who art our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. When Helen and I were at the Worship and Music Conference a couple of weeks ago, I already had this text in my mind, looking ahead, knowing that it was coming up and would be one of the ones I was preaching on. It's Paul talking about my power is made perfect in weakness, and the things that he felt compelled to argue with and boast about. And it just felt at some point like my head was too full of stuff, so I decided to do something a little bit different that week. I enrolled in a pottery class there at Montreat for the weeks. First time I'd ever done that. Helen often takes a class in this wonderful arts and crafts and pottery building that they have there in Montreat, but I've never done that. But I decided to give it a shot, and so I enrolled in a beginner's throwing clay class. And I went on Monday to begin the process of throwing clay and making a potted coffee mug. And that's supposed to be one of the easier things to make, I guess. And I was very intent about it, very excited about it. I had heard that it was a difficult thing to do, throw clay. But I thought, well, if I focused enough and I followed instructions just perfectly, I could probably get it right, And I began to think, well, maybe I could even show up some of the other beginners in class too with a coffee mug here. Who knows? But I'd give it a shot. And so began that process. And I was grouped with about 4 or 5 other young people between the ages of 16 and 18. And whereas I was very focused, they were just throwing clay everywhere, just doing whatever they could, and one thing after another. And finally, an instructor came over to me and practically held my hands to guide me through the process of getting the clay centered on the wheel and then helping it to rise, and working so closely with me. She could tell how intent and focused I was. Almost thought she was going to start to massage my shoulders to let up on it a little bit to get this right. And then finally she took her hands away from mine and she said, "You've got it there. I think you've got it. Now just make it come up evenly, keep it centered." And I was working on it, and right at that point, that was the point when I was really thinking, this is going to be a pretty nice looking coffee mug, that the clay just went bloop and sort of fell halfway over, and I really pulled my hands away as fast as I could, which you're not supposed to do because it just sort of make it worse, and the wheel stopped, and I looked at it and I thought, oh, what a disaster. How in the world did that happen? But the instructor who was working with me said, no, let's just look at it. That's interesting, but maybe you can try again with another lump of clay. And I thought, well, yeah, just throw this one away. She said, no, we won't throw it away. Something will happen with that. And I'm looking at it and said, no, you better throw this one away. There's not much that's going to happen with it. But she convinced me to keep it. So we set it aside, and then we began to work on another coffee mug, and she kept her hands on mine the whole time. So that the mug actually took shape at one point, and I began to focus my attention on the mug that she and I made together and lose interest in the mug that really had more of my work involved in it. But she made me keep both mugs, and we fired both mugs, and at one point we had started to work on mugs, carving and trimming them, and she even took that mug that had sort of fallen over and said, it's not a coffee cup, but maybe. I said, well, maybe it has a lip on it. Maybe it can be a pitcher. So we carved some little leaves in it, and I still wanted to throw it away, but she made me keep it and whatnot. I was focused on the mug that actually looked like you could drink out of it. But we set them aside, and they were to be put in the kiln and fired and whatnot through all the process over the next few days. And in the middle of the week, Helen and I walking along, and we ran across a woman who works in the Pottery Center all summer long as one of the instructors. She hadn't been working with me that day, but she had been there. And she came up and she said, "Dan, Dan, I heard something wonderful happened in the pottery when you were there. I heard you made a pitcher. I said, no, I made a coffee mug. She said, no, I heard you I made a coffee mug. And she looked confused. She said, well, I heard you made a pitcher. I said, well, I was trying to make a coffee mug, and the thing sort of fell over and became a pitcher. And I don't really want to talk about that. I'd like to talk about the coffee mug that looked really nice. And she says, oh, no. You see, what happened was at the end of the day, all the art instructors gathered and they got together and they shared their highs and their lows for the day. And I'm looking at her and she said, and one of the instructors, she said, well, there was this nice man who was trying to make a coffee mug and it just fell apart and it became a pitcher. But as we worked on it together, it really became something lovely. And seeing him work on it like that, it was just one of the highs of the day. And I just looked at her, puzzled, confused for the rest of the week. How is it that my collapsed piece of clay could be the high when it was absolutely the low for me in the middle of the week? How come the coffee mug, which you could actually drink out of, that I sort of admired, it wasn't the high? No, it was my weakness. And she saw it after working with me and seeing what it became, something of a high. It just didn't make sense to me. And it kept me unsettled for the rest of the week. And it kept me bothered as I returned again and again to this passage from Paul as he writes to the Corinthians, as he finds himself in a struggle having to talk about who you're going to listen to, who you're going to follow, who has authority for you in matters of faith and practice. Are you going to pay attention to just those super apostles who seem so impressive, who seem to be getting everything right, who seem to be so glamorous in your eyes? Now, what about me? Remember me? Think about the things that I've endured. Think about who I was when I was there in your midst. Who are you going to follow? Who are you going to listen to? Especially when it comes to talking about how we will engage with each other and how we will engage with the world as we try to understand the character and nature of our Christian faith and what it means to be a Christian. Who are you going to listen to when someone is telling you what to do as a Christian? Who are you going to listen to when someone is telling you who you should be as a Christian? That's really what's at the heart of what Paul is talking to the Corinthians about here. And he seems to be saying to them, be very careful that you don't get off track. Be very careful that you think about who you're listening to, who you're following, what's become important to you, the kind of things that you really value. Because I can tell you from my own life, Paul says, that it's not always what it looks like. That it's not always what you think. Sometimes real strength is discovered in weakness. I can tell you, Paul says, that if you want to follow the Christ that I introduced to you, then you better be careful and not go astray. And remember to follow the weakness. Follow the weakness. Paul's always forcefully engaged in this issue with the churches that he founds, this issue of telling them what it means to be a Christian, describing to them how they should act, what they're supposed to do. Think about all the things that Paul talks to the churches that he founds, the things that he talks to them about. Here are just some of the things specifically in Corinthians that we remember Paul saying to them. I don't think you should eat meat that's been sacrificed to idols. It might taste delicious, but when you do that, everybody gets confused about who you believe in. It might appear that you're more interested in that idol than you are in just a good steak. Be careful. Don't eat the wrong things. Or Paul says, I want you to give money. I want you to give money to the people, to the saints in Jerusalem, just like the Macedonians have given. The folks in Jerusalem are hurting and they need help. And you've got a lot, and it will do your soul good to give generously. Or Paul will say something like that. I don't think it's a good idea as Christians to get hitched up to unbelievers It just won't mix well. Or Paul says, you know that person that has caused you so much trouble, we've been talking about them and talking about the things that they've done, and I gave you instructions for how to deal with them, how you should punish that person. Well, now I'm telling you that you need to forgive him, that you need to reaffirm your love for him, you need to find a way to bring him back into the community, because it isn't right that you should just continually beat him down and make him feel excessively sorrowful. That's the kind of stuff Paul talks about to the people he cares about, to those he's trying to help understand what it means to live as a Christian. You remember, he says to them, you quit fighting. The way that you go at it with each other, holding up different spokespersons like they're the ones that everybody should be following, the way that you go at it, the way that you choose favorites, the way that you are just glamorizing some folks as opposed to others, it just makes it look like Jesus Christ is all torn up to pieces amongst you. Quit it. Quit your fighting. Or even Paul goes so far as to say, here's the bottom line. You've got to clean up your behavior. Idolatry, promiscuity, stealing, drunkenness, greed. You can't go on living like that all week long and then try to slide in the church like no one notices. You're going to have to decide here, are you a part of this kingdom or are you a part of that kingdom? Do you belong to that king or do you belong to that God? This is a very big part of Paul's work, trying to help the people that he's introduced to Christ understand and know what it means to live in a Christ-like way. And one of the problems that Paul seems to find himself in again and again is that people tend to wander and they start to listen to everybody else, and suddenly other leaders come in and they seem to suggest that we have a way which is easier, which is more impressive, which is more convincing. Don't listen to Paul anymore, listen to us. And so we find ourselves here in this second letter to Corinthians where Paul's tone has suddenly changed from talking about how dear and important they are to them to talking about they have to be careful about who they're following. They have to remember what it is that Paul had taught them. They have to hold on to the way that Paul himself had lived in their midst, giving himself completely over to them, even if that seemed to be a way of weakness. They had to remember that way of weakness, because it was in that way of weakness, Paul's living amongst them, that he was able to truly present to them the wonder of God's gospel, of God's love for each and every one of them. That's what I think Paul is getting at, even if it sounds hard for us to hear him get to it as he talks about boasting about this or as he talks about boasting about that, because even as he goes through his own personal history, and it may sound confusing to us, what he finally wants us to hear is, look, folks, when it comes down to it, it was in my weakness that I discovered God's grace. It was in my weakness that I found God's strength. As we find it so difficult in these times ourselves, trying to decide who we listen to, what does it mean to be a Christian? Does Christianity look like that? Maybe we need to hear Paul say, it was in my weakness where God's grace became sufficient for me. Even to the point of my being given something that was difficult and hard to bear, even to the point of finding myself in a daily, constant, ongoing, painful, burdensome struggle that I asked God to take away from me, but he didn't. And said to me again and again, even in the midst of that, Paul, you'll understand and you'll know. My grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in weakness. What would it mean for us to hear that today? What would it mean for us to listen to people like that today? What would it mean for you and I whenever we hear the world talking about how wonderful something powerful is, how important something big is, how loud the right people always sound? Maybe it's important in some way. What would it mean for us in some way to follow the weakness, or even to follow the weakest? Helen talked last week, amongst many things, about our going to see the movie about Fred Rogers. And it's such a powerful experience. We both may be talking about it for quite a while. But David Brooks wrote about it in a column this past week. And one of the things that David Brooks said is that it's amazing when you go to see this movie in a theater, the number of people that begin by dabbing their eyes and having a tear here and there, to the number of people that are just practically opening and sobbing by the end of the movie. And he asked, what in the world is going on that the audience is so moved? And Brooks says the power is in Rogers' radical kindness at a time when public kindness is scarce. It's as if the pressure of living in a time such as ours gets released in that theater as we're reminded that, oh yes, this is how people can be. And then Brooks goes on to remember a time when another journalist, Tom Junod, in a profile in Esquire, describes how he and Rogers met a 14-year-old boy whose cerebral palsy left him sometimes unable to walk or to even talk. And Rogers went up and asked that boy, and after a conversation with him, Mr. Rogers asked the boy to pray for him, Mr. Rogers. And the boy was thunderstruck. He had been the object of prayers many times, but nobody had asked him to pray for somebody else. And he said he would try to pray for Mr. Rogers, since Mr. Rogers must be close to God. And if Mr. Rogers liked him, then it must be okay. And then later, the journalist Junod complimented Mr. Rogers, he said, on his cleverly boosting the boy's self-esteem. But Mr. Rogers didn't look at the situation like that at all. And he said to the journalist, "Oh no, Tom, by no means. I didn't ask him for his prayers for him. I asked for me. I asked him because I think that anyone who has gone through the challenges like this young boy has gone through, anyone who has gone through that must be very close to God. And I asked him because I wanted his intercession." And then Brooks writes, "Here is the radicalism that infused the whole movie. That the child is closer to God than the adult, that the sick are closer than the healthy, that the poor are closer than the rich, that the marginalized closer than the celebrated." What would it mean for us to follow the weakness? At one point in the movie, as they showed scenes from Mr. Rogers' show, they show a scene of the tiger puppet who stood in for Rogers' inner child, singing a song that goes something like this: "Sometimes I wonder if I'm a mistake," meaning, I'm so different, am I a mistake? And in that scene, an adult character sang along with the puppet and tried to reassure him that he was not a mistake, but the puppet was not reassured. And as Alice Lloyd reminds us in the Weekly Standard, deep and simple is far more essential than shallow and complex. And this was a favorite maxim of Mr. Rogers. Deep and simple, follow the weakness, watch the small. We're going to be doing that this week at Vacation Bible School. And it will take all the strength we can muster. It'll take all the strength that so many of the people here have already given to it, all the time and effort and attention, because we will have before us 60 of God's precious weak ones, and we'll be following them around room to room, watching them, hovering over them, helping them to make pots that look like coffee mugs, or to appreciate it when the science experiment goes haywire and they end up with just a pile of something again. My favorite part of Vacation Bible School is at the end of the week when everybody's gone and everybody who's worked on it is just gathered there together talking about highs and lows. And somebody will say, well, it was a high for me when that child said, I think I saw God there in the Bible story room where the lady was reading Bible stories. Or I think that snack looked a little bit like Jesus. Or somebody will say, well, the high was just holding their hand as they walked from one room to another. What would it mean for the world if we spent a little more time following the one who was weak for our sake? The one who showed us by the way that he lived what it means, my grace is sufficient for you? Give it a try. Give it a try. Amen.